The Extraordinary Phenomenon Investigations Council presents Epic Voyages. Come join us as we enter and experience the great mysteries of the world with tonight's host,
Laurel Tague. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Epic Voyages Radio on InceptionRadioNetwork.com. My name is Laurel Tague, and I hope all of you had a safe and a very peaceful July 4th holiday. We're going to spend the next hour and a half learning all about electromagnetic pulses, EMPs. Tonight's guest on Epic Voyages is Ross Howarth, who is the VP and General Manager of EMPact America. That's EMPact America, which is the largest electromagnetic pulse advocacy organization in the United States. It's a nonprofit organization of citizens concerned with protecting people from nuclear, EMP, and natural disasters. A catastrophic EMP event could occur naturally from a great geomagnetic storm with effects virtually identical to those of a nuclear EMP attack. However, two congressional commissions, the EMP Commission and the Strategic Posture Commission, have both warned us that terrorists or rogue states could pretty easily inflict an EMP attack that would collapse critical civilian infrastructure, for example, electricity, water utilities, food distribution, all telecommunications, transportation, as in airplanes flying out of the sky and dropping to Earth, banking, finance, and medical technology, just for starters. Well, such a storm, such as a geomagnetic storm, is inevitable. They say that it occurs every century or so, but it hasn't since the advent of modern electronics. Some scientists actually say that we're overdue for such a storm. So whether it's coming from a nuclear man-made event or it's coming from the sun, we need to know more about this. And so I'm really excited to turn this over and talk to Ross and have him school us about EMPs and why we all should get a little more familiar with the subject. Ross, how are you doing tonight?
Very well. Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, we're thrilled to have you here. I've heard about EMPs, and especially in the last several months with all the talk about the solar flares and Class X events and all of that. But do you mind giving everybody just a little bit of a primer on what an EMP is and what exactly it does?
Sure, absolutely. First, I think that you gave a fantastic introduction. Basically, an electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, is a high-intensity burst of electromagnetic energy. And it can happen multiple ways. And the two most talked about ways, and the two ways that we actually focus on, and it's really because of their result, is an EMP can be caused by a natural event, like the large severe solar storms or your coronal mass ejection, or by a malicious act using a weapon, like a high-altitude nuclear burst. But it could also be a handheld or even, in the back of a vehicle, a weapon that's they usually call that an RF weapon or an IEMI weapon, radio frequency weapon. We don't focus on those as much because they're of limited scope. In other words, you could take out an area with it, you could take out a convoy with it, you could do some major damage, and coordinated, you could do some really big damage. But the reason that we focused on the coronal mass ejection and the high altitude nuclear burst is because it really sets up a unique situation in our country where you could collapse the entire power grid, and when it comes to a solar storm, you can even have a worldwide event, essentially, where you've got the complete power outage, and we're not talking about for a couple of hours or a couple of days. We're talking about at least months, if not years, In fact, the EMP Commission that you had mentioned earlier estimated that if we had either one of these on a large-scale basis, you could be out for 4 to 10 years, and I could get into I'll get into a little bit more about how that would happen and why that would happen. But that's what we're really concerned about. If you look at the way that our country is set up currently to deal with emergencies and disasters, we're really set up for regional events. We're set up for things, at best like a Katrina, and you could argue, of course, that we're not ready for that, or what's going on with the blackouts right now down in the South with all these people who are dying, even around the D.C. area because of a regular power outage. But essentially, in a situation where you can use outside help, you can either you can evacuate the area, or you can have people come in. You can get a phone and a FEMA credit card, and you can call for help, and you can bring in experts from all over the country to help out. This would be a situation where everybody's down. So there's, first of all, for those who follow, maybe like bug out bags or things like that, have evacuation plans. There's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to go out to. Maybe somewhere that's less populated than where you are, but there may not be a safe haven. And secondly, of course, you have no help coming. So it's really an intense and scary situation. The other thing that I really want to point out at the outset is, as I think again that you laid a fantastic foundation for, is that this is something that, while not necessarily widely known, is extremely real, extremely credible, and really doesn't have scientific detractors in the scientific community, because you do have, first of all, the official position of the United States of America coming out of the EMP Commission, and you had their executive. They started in 2001. This is a congressional commission, which is really set up to say, here's what the facts are. They had at their disposal the entire access to the entire United States government, and anything that they needed as far as information. Most of this information had been classified prior to this, and we can talk about the background, but the government did know about EMP for a long, long time before this. But the EMP Commission was put together in 2001. They put out an executive report in 2004 that's available online, and I recommend highly that everyone take a look at it, even if they were to just take a look at it for the executive summary. I think that really sums it up. It really says it all about just how large of a problem this is and how devastating it could be. And then they put out actually a final report in 2008 where they even came out with plans and suggestions about what could be done. And in the end, it was really a good news story, because essentially they were saying this is really one of the only huge things that is a threat to the entire country and our ongoing ability to remain, a power or a country at all, but that we can fix. We can actually take this threat off the table. And then, of course, since then, you've had the Academy of Science report come out on severe space weather events. It came out in 2008. Then you mentioned America's strategic posture reports. They had an executive and a final report that came out in 2009. And you've since then had high-impact, low-frequency event reports that came out from the North American Bulk Power System. You've had the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission put out a study in 2010. There's been conferences in, for example, there was an In the Dark conference that we participated in that was for military planning that was at the U.S. Army War College, and there was another one down at National Defense University that we participated in last year. And so there's really no question about, I don't think, what would happen. It's just a matter, I think, of when it would happen. And as you pointed out, on the solar side, it's inevitable. We've had these huge storms in the past. They're going to happen again. It's just a matter of when. And on the nuclear side, we're in a dangerous world. We obviously the Soviets and the Chinese and many others have had the power for not only EMP weapons, but what they call super EMP weapons for a long time. But we're at the stage now where you have rogue states that have nuclear weapons, and you only need one, and it doesn't have to be used on a ballistic missile. So this is something that you could use even a medium range or short range rocket off of the coast, off of a ship, and scuttle the ship, and do a lot of damage with it.
What you just said was something I was just getting ready to bring up. One of the most terrifying thoughts to me when I first started looking into this was the fact that somebody, and Ross, I'm sure you'll remember what the person's name is, but someone's scenario is that a couple of tankers or something could be off the coast of the U.S. and fire that thing up into the higher atmosphere and then sink the boat, and no one would even be able to prove who did it. It's just done, over and done.
Absolutely. I mean, that was actually a scenario that was put in the EMP Commission reports. The EMP Commission's nightmare scenario was just that. You could, first of all, you could knock out the entire country with one nuclear weapon, and it doesn't have to be a huge nuclear weapon. It could be an early, phase nuclear weapon if you put it up high enough in the middle of the country. So to try to explain this in a way that maybe people can visualize it, I know this is radio and I'm not on Skype, but if you were to take a flashlight, anybody who's ever taken a flashlight or, and held it down near a table, and you see a little dot that's, about the size of the radius of the flashlight itself. But as you lift that flashlight up, that circle gets wider and wider and wider. And that's line of sight. And essentially, you're talking about energy that's moving at the speed of light in line of sight. And so to have a true, there is an EMP effect if there's a detonation on the ground, but what we're talking about here is a detonation above the atmosphere. First of all, if you have a detonation on the ground, what are you most concerned about? Well, you're concerned about there's going to be a blast, there's going to be radiation, there's going to be instant devastation, and within that area, those are the things that you're primarily going to be concerned about. But if you think about it, even that is of limited scope. I mean, you're taking out a city or you're taking out a region. But when you talk about if you only had one or a couple of weapons, or even if you didn't, this other method doesn't require any precise targeting ability. You loft it up, and wherever it goes off, as long as your target is within that line of sight radius, that's a hit. That's a direct hit. You could be 100 or more miles off, and you still have a direct hit, unlike a targeted weapon. So when this thing is up above the atmosphere and it goes off, you have this flush of electrons that comes down, and there are various phases to it that we can get into more detail about. But essentially, you're talking about knocking out, electronics, particularly microprocessors, and also these large transformers that are the crux of this issue. And you're doing it in a way where there may not be an immediate effect on people. There is no blast, there is no radiation, and so the problem becomes really one of power. And it's a very high-tech way of killing people by old-fashioned means, because the way that they're going to die is going to be from lack of water, dehydration, from starvation, from lack of sanitation. They're not going to have any of the electronics that keep us alive today. And if you think about it, we are so hyper-dependent on electricity in this country at this point, we simply can't live without it, as evidenced by what's going on right now in the D.C. area, and down south. But it's far worse than that, because at least there, people are able to get out, they're still able to get gas, they're able to bring generators in, they're able to do other things that would simply not be possible if everything was out and if the entire grid was down.
Mm-hmm. First of all, let me remind everybody you're listening to Epic Voyages Radio on InceptionRadioNetwork.com, and our guest is Ross Howarth from the EMPact America organization. As you were talking, I remember something that I read last week, that the bomb that went off in Hiroshima was actually set off at 1,900 feet, which isn't very high at all in altitude. And it was a 13-kiloton bomb. And so most of the destruction from that was the heat, which led to a firestorm, which led to the destruction and incineration. But what we're talking about is, what would you say, 250 miles, 500 miles above the Earth?
Well, it really depends. I mean, you can get the proper EMP effects starting at about 19 miles high. Now, again, when you start talking about line of sight, if it's 19 miles high, then you're talking about a radius of hundreds of miles and not necessarily thousands of miles. But to give you an example, if you were to, at 19 miles high, if you were to launch something up, say, like around New York City, you could easily get all of New York City, Washington, D.C., and upwards out past, Buffalo. And consequently, you'd certainly collapse. We have three main power grids in this country. Mm-hmm. We have an eastern grid, we have a western grid, and as I'm sure you know, there's a grid in Texas, a separate grid in Texas. But the truth is, they're all interconnected. So if you have the type of outage that we're talking about here, it's pretty likely to cascade, beyond even if you only hit one grid. But to your point, if you were between 3 and, say, 400 miles high and you were to place something over the middle of the country, you could get the entire country with, say, a Hiroshima-sized and type weapon.
Right. I'm going to take this opportunity, Ross, to plug this book. I had a book sent by William Forstchen, and I'm going to put it on the chat room here. The name of the book is 1 Second After. It's written by William Forstchen, who is a history professor at one of the most beautiful places in our country, near Black Mountain, North Carolina. And this book, it's only about 350 pages, and it is chilling. After about 20 pages into the beginning of the book, what turns out to be a birthday party for a 12-year-old daughter, everybody's cell phone just stopped working, and nobody knew what was going on. They didn't think much about it. And then they noticed they couldn't hear traffic down on the interstate, and that's where it started. Most of the book actually takes place in just a couple or 3 weeks, although by the end of the book you've gone for a full year, and it literally changes what you conceive to be your reality. Is there anyone out there listening who is diabetic? You might be able to make it for 30 days because all of that insulin is produced and brought just in time to the pharmacies to be given out by prescription, and that won't happen anymore. There won't be any kind of drugs. People in the hospital that are on technology, it's off. It doesn't come back on again. Even if you had a backup generator that ran on gasoline or natural gas, as soon as that fuel runs out, if the electronics didn't already get fried, it won't work anymore. Ross?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And in fact, Bill Forstchen is a friend of ours. In fact, I just did an interview with him on our show, our EMPact Radio show, for the 4th of July. And we were talking about the fact that they're looking at making that book into a movie, and I really hope they do because that can change the entire ballgame on awareness. But to give you, an idea, first of all, I've bought thousands of copies of that book. Last lot I bought of them was over 5,000 copies, and we've given them away as part of our education process at EMPact America, even though it's technically a fictional book because it needs to be, because this has never happened. And I think what's most important to say about that is that this is one of those situations that we only get one shot at. If you can imagine something like this happening, we tend to be a reactionary country, a reactionary society. We're always fighting last time's war. We're always looking at last time's problem, whether it's a hurricane or anything else. And the problem here is that you only get one bite at the apple. If you were to have an event like this, whether solar or man-made, that's it. There is no second shot. There's no let's fix it for next time, which is why EMPact America focuses so hard on this particular issue. We focus on other national security issues, and we focus on individual preparedness for many other things, but with particular focus on the power grid in general. And there are many ways that the power grid can go down, whether it's cyber, pandemic, or et cetera. But EMP is one of those things that has to scare anyone who really gives it any thought, because it's something that is, quite frankly, our Achilles heel. And the worst part of it is that anybody, our worst enemies all know about it. They're all very well aware of it, and in fact have, many of them have actually threatened it, and even recently.
Ross, we have a question that just came in on the chat room here, and it's a very good one. I definitely want you to reveal to everybody the history of the United States. It goes back to that Starfish Prime, but this is an excellent question. How can you protect against an EMP, or can you protect against it?
Yeah, it's a great question. First thing I want to say is that, to be honest with you, to do it right, this is something that really does need to be focused at the national level. And even people who normally, obviously there's a lot of people who aren't, they don't want big government, they don't want government involved in things, but there are places where it is appropriate, and that includes something where you have, no regulation on something that's critical to your nation, and where essentially right now it's just kind of cobbled together, and there's no universal way of protecting it. So if you can imagine, if you protected part of the grid, but the rest of the grid collapsing would cause the part you protected to likely be affected and go down, it makes sense that you have to really try to protect the whole thing, or at least critical parts of it. Now, to answer the question properly, I do have to explain a little bit about that 4 to 10 year estimate that I had given you before about how long we could be down. The big problem, okay, is these large transformers. Now, I can talk about individuals and what they can do in just a second, but this is really, really important. I think people need to understand it. You've got these large transformers, and I'm not talking about the ones that are out on the pole outside your house, or even the ones that are down at the transfer station. I'm talking about the ones at the power generation. I'm talking about, and there are key ones and hub ones where there may be something between, let's say, 3 to 500, depending on how you wanted to classify them. These are things that cost, upwards of, $1 million or more. They're the size of a house. And what they do is they're converting up the power, converting down the power on the national level where they're transferring massive amounts of energy. And we need them to make our power grid work. There are ones that are critical. If they go down, we're in big, big trouble. Now, we have less than 1% spares of these things. They are not made in the United States of America.
Oh, good.
We've exported that because, we're too smart to, we're too busy to make anything like that. So we buy ours from North Korea and Germany and places like that. And it takes 18 months or more to make one. They're specially made. They're handmade by people with skills who can do that. So you can't just start up a new shop tomorrow and do this. And it's 18 months to make one, which means it's double that to make two and triple that to make three, because there isn't a production line. These things aren't falling off, and being put into a box and stamped with Amazon and shipped off. And the other thing is that there's usually a backlog of them. So there may be a 3 to 5 year wait right now for one. Now imagine if you needed 300 to 500 of them. How long would it take to get them?
Oh,
assuming someone would sell them to you, assuming that they'd extend you credit, assuming that they could get them to you, assuming that once they got them to you, you could transfer them within the country and that you could put these things together. And quite frankly, that's not an easy feat either. They take massive, I'm not talking about tractor trailers, I'm talking about specially designed machines that move these things and giant cranes that are involved in replacing them. So this is a complicated thing. However, to go into answering your question a little bit about how would you protect against that, well, there are several things actually that can be done. The good news is the federal government, and we can talk about the history, the federal government's known about EMP for a long time, and there have been people working this issue for a long time. And there are basic categories of ways of doing protection. One of them is, blocking technology and grounding technology. And so with a little bit of planning and a little bit of money, you can protect these things in place while they're operating. You have to take them down to do it, but after that, they're up and running. As an example, for probably somewhere between $200,000 to $250,000, let's say, for one of these blocking devices, I'm going to oversimplify this, but it essentially would work like a surge protector works for your computer in a lightning storm. So, it would sense this thing and it would protect the transformer from melting. And we've had them melt, by the way, from geomagnetic storms, and we've seen other problems in real life, so it's not theoretical.
Hold on just 1 second, Ross.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. What I had read a little bit this weekend is that one of the problems with expecting something along the order of a surge protector to work is that this happens so fast that those protection whatever you call them, valves or whatever, they cannot react quickly enough to do their job. Is that right?
Yes, and so remember I said I was oversimplifying a little bit, so let me clarify because I think that is important and I think it's an excellent point that you're making. A regular surge protector that would protect against lightning is not fast enough to catch the E1 pulse and not strong enough to protect against the E3 pulse, and I'll have to explain what those are. But essentially, that's absolutely true. And so when I talk about these other things, they are specially designed, they're faster, and they work a little different. And some of them work with air gaps and other things like that. So, it's a little bit more than a surge protector, but the concept is that it's protecting it in place.
Okay.
And now another, partial solution to that, and it's a necessary part of it, is that for those critical transformers, that we buy more spares and we keep them and, we can put them in a Faraday cage, which maybe is simply, first of all, things that aren't plugged in are far less likely to be damaged. And when it comes to the difference between, and again, when we get into a little bit more of the science of this, there is a difference between a nuclear weapon and a great geomagnetic storm And with the great geomagnetic storms, for the most part, if things aren't plugged in, then they're going to be fine, other than the fact that when it comes to things like cars or any other electronics that are going to require other inputs, you're not going to get them. So you made the point earlier about generators. There's not going to be more gas. Cars, there's not going to be more gas. So at the end of the day, you're still in the bad situation. But when it comes to the transformers, you could maybe, if you had enough spares for a great geomagnetic storm, you could theoretically, again, it's going to take a lot of work, and who knows how you're going to move them, and all that has to be planned out. And a lot of this is about planning. But you could put yourself at least in a position where instead of the losses that are expected under the current situation, you could get it to where we might not lose everything. And I want to just give you another example. The EMP Commission, they had estimated, and then the others had expanded on this, but between the experts, they've really estimated that in the first year that you had mentioned Forshin's book covers, they would expect somewhere between 2/3 and 90% of the U.S. population to be dead,
right.
to be wiped out. And why? Again, because of water, lack of sanitation, lack of food. I mean, it used to be that there were farmers. There were every outside of the little city hubs and things like that, everybody was a farmer. I mean, at this point, we've got 2% of the American population that are farmers, and they're feeding 100%, and they're doing it with technology. They're doing it with electricity. And we're not even making all of our own food. We're importing a lot of food. But even with that, do you think that their current irrigation systems are going to work? Do you think that their current technology, their tractors, and all the things that make our just-in-time, highly civilized, production, an optimized production, none of that's going to work. Mm-hmm. And so the last time that we would be in a technological state that we might see ourselves in after an event like this, we probably had an entire population the size that's on, Long Island right now.
I hate getting old. I had this wonderful thought right here in the front of my head, and it just fell off. While I'm struggling with senility here, tell us, this was a real shock to me when I first read about Starfish Prime and how the U.S. first found out that EMPs could be